is responsible for operations, curation, and strategic planning at Point Ellice House Museum and Gardens. Kelly has more than a decade of experience in heritage, museums, and nonprofit management. He received his PhD in Canadian Studies from Carleton University, and his research interests include settler Indigenous relations, public/local history, the ENN land grant, and renaming. Kelly is also an adjunct professor in the Department of History at Vancouver Island University and president of the Friends of the BC Archives. So welcome, Kelly. I'm very much looking forward to hearing you speak tonight, as I'm sure we all are.
Thanks, Christine, and nice to see so many familiar faces, former students and colleagues and friends. This is great. Hi to everybody. Christine tells me I have about half an hour or so to talk a little bit about Point Ellice House, and I know a few of you are very familiar with Point Ellice House. And, Amy especially helps me out at Point Ellice House. Nice to see you, Amy. Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm just going to share a PowerPoint presentation with everyone. And tonight I'm just going to introduce people to Point Ellice House and talk about a couple of things that we've been up to in the last couple of years. Hopefully everyone can see that. The first thing I always like to ask when I give presentations like this about Point Ellice House is, who's ever been to Point Ellice House before? Maybe raise your virtual hand, or I see Daryl there, and I got to scroll through everybody here, but keep your hand up. No, most people haven't. Amy, yeah, okay, I know Amy has. Nora, maybe? Nora, you've been? That's great. The reason I like to ask that is because it's one of the most common things we hear from visitors that come to Point Ellice House is either I've never heard of it, or I've lived in Victoria all my life, or I've lived on Vancouver all my life and I've never visited. Or the other one is, oh, I came there once in 1987 and I never came back. So that's why I like to start with that question. So if you've never been to Point Ellice House, I'll just explain where it is. It's in Victoria. It's in what we call the Rock Bay neighborhood, or in a larger sense, the Burnside Gorge neighborhood. As some of you might be aware, Victoria is very neighborhood-centric city, and so we're part of the Burnside Gorge community. We're basically just before you cross what people like to call the Bay Street Bridge, but what is actually officially called the Point Ellice Bridge. And so we are at 2616 Pleasant Street. Pleasant might not be so pleasant these days, and I'll get to that in a little bit. You can get to us, car, bike, rollerblade, skateboard, and you can also take the Victoria Harbour Ferry to Point Ellice House. We're at on the Selkirk Water, just before the Gorge Waterway starts. So when we're open, you can hop on the little Victoria Harbour Ferry boats and visit us. So what is Point Ellice House? Yes, it's a historic house. And as I said, it's positioned overlooking the Selkirk Water, and it is one of the oldest homes in Victoria, in British Columbia for that matter, that's still standing. The two older ones in Victoria would be Todd House in Oak Bay and Helmeken House, which is today at and operated by the Royal BC Museum. Those were built in the 1850s. The house was started in June of 1861. So in a couple of weeks here, it'll be exactly 160 years since construction started at Point Ellice House. And the architects of Point Ellice House, at least in the first iteration of it, there's a couple of additions that were made in later years, were John Wright and George Sanders. And if you've heard of them, you're probably familiar with Victoria architecture. They were the first practicing architects north of San Francisco, it's like people like to say. And so they're responsible for a number of buildings that are still with us in Victoria. The other contemporary historic house museum that was also designed by Wright and Sanders is Carr House, which is on Government Street, the childhood home of Emily Carr, also built in 1862. So the house and the gardens are a national, provincial, and municipal heritage site or historic site. And in 1975, the province of British Columbia purchased Point Ellice House from the last descendants of the O'Reilly family, John O'Reilly and his wife Inez. And they had operated it as a private museum for a few years prior to that. And then the province owned it and still owns it, but in the early 2000s devolved the management of the site to not-for-profits. And so we are, the Vancouver Island Local History Society is the third or fourth nonprofit in the last 20 years to manage the site. So what's interesting about Point Ellice House? Three things I want to highlight tonight if you've never heard of it or you're curious. There's three interesting things: the collection that we have, the families that lived at Point Ellice House, 2 families, and the gardens and the landscape of Point Ellice House. There's 2 acres at Point Ellice House. And so I'm going to touch on a few of these things and then talk about how we are updating Point Ellice House for the 21st century. So I mentioned that we are a not-for-profit that operates Point Ellice House on behalf of the province of British Columbia. We took over management of the site in 2019, and the first thing that we wanted to do was turn Point Ellice House into a professional museum. Now, one of the reasons we wanted to do that was because you may know that Point Ellice House has really been associated with tourism and afternoon tea service. And that's the #1 thing that people have come to know about Point Ellice House, is that it's a place to go and have afternoon tea on the lawn, which is all fine and maybe a quintessential Victoria experience, but you can get tea just about anywhere in Victoria, and you can get it at places that do it a lot better. And with such an important historic site, we wanted to really just focus on the museum and telling the stories that the place can tell. And so we don't serve tea anymore, and you'll find, and you'll see in this presentation tonight, that we've really focused on telling the stories of Point Ellice House, of Victoria, and BC and Canadian history as well. And we think that Point Ellice House has a really important role to play in truth and reconciliation. Again, something that I'll talk about tonight. And we've also been working very hard to reintroduce Point Ellice House to the community, including to our neighbors and the businesses in the neighborhood. When I first started at Point Ellice House, I went around to all the local businesses introducing myself, and most people were like, "Oh, where's that?" These are businesses that are like 2 blocks away. So there was a lot of work to do, and there's still a lot of work to do, as I think you'll see, but we've been making good progress. So as I said, we're turning away from operation as a tea house and a sort of static site. If you did visit Point Ellice House that one time in 1987, it didn't change. It had been the same, basically. The inside of the house had basically been unchanged for 30 or 40 years. I mentioned the collection as one of the things that's interesting about Point Ellice House. And because it's such a vast collection, which I'll talk about shortly, it really gives us these great material objects as a way to tell all kinds of stories. And so it's a really rich place to invite people back time and again for new experiences and new stories. And sometimes it's almost overwhelming, the amount of stories that there are and the amount of research that's yet to be done. This is a place that's been a historic site since 1975, and it's actually quite stunning, the limited research that's been done over the years. Again, something I'll mention. Our inaugural exhibit that we had in our new feature exhibit space that we constructed was called The Politics of Luxury, and that introduced the visitor to the families of Point Ellice House, particularly the O'Reilly family. You see Kathleen, Frank, and Jack O'Reilly pictured in the image on the screen here. And their parents, Peter and Caroline O'Reilly, purchased Point Ellice House in 1867. And these 3 grew up at Point Ellice House. Kathleen, and Jack were born and died at Point Ellice House. In fact, Kathleen was born about a week after they moved into the house. Our second exhibit, which is reopening soon, is called Springs and Scavengers, Waste and Water in Victoria. 1842 to 1915. And this is our first exhibit where we use the house to tell wider stories. And so we wanted to use this experience that we all have in, if we're lucky enough to have a home, of going to the bathroom and flushing the toilet and getting fresh drinking water out of the tap. We all need to go to the bathroom. We all need to drink water. And people have been doing that at Point Ellice House for 160 years. And so we've used our collection and the stories we have and the connections that the family have to link to these broader stories about where did Victoria get its water? How did Victoria dispose of its waste? So the house is sort of formed a hub to spin out talking to the Nanaimo Historical Society here, you know what I'm talking about. A couple of spokes in our collection to tell wider stories. Part of taking over the site meant also refreshing the interpretive themes. Really, there were a few key stories, and some of you have heard me talk about this before, that became the dominant narratives at Point Ellice House. And so one of the things we wanted to do was identify some key interpretive themes to understand all of these stories in history. I won't go through all of these, but you can see here that they focus on things we're familiar with, maybe in a regular house museum, like the house and how it was built and who built it and its architectural style. But then, of course, we have gender history, highlighted primarily, but not exclusively, through Kathleen, and what it was like growing up as a child in Victoria and in the Victorian era. And then something that's a bit new and a bit different is talking about the history of heritage. You know, John and Inez opened Point Ellice House as a private museum in 1967. So visitors have been coming and experiencing Point Ellice House since the 1960s. Well, sorry to say, that's history now. And so we're starting to talk about how the site has been interpreted in the past, because as I'm sure you all know, that changes over time. This is a picture that was on my first slide. And one of our other interpretive themes is talking about domestic servants at Point Ellice House. This picture is from about 1883, and we don't know who the people are in this image. It's been mislabeled as the O'Reillys, but these are not the O'Reillys here. We think that this might be an image of the staff of Point Ellice House. And you can see here a few people that are grouped over here, which and then all the way over on the other side here, a Chinese domestic house servant. Because the O'Reilly family has extensive collection at Point Ellice House, but also an extensive documentary record at the BC Archives, we're lucky enough to know some of the names of the Chinese domestic house servants and also the other European settler servants and staff that worked at Point Ellice House. And so we've actually identified them by name in some of our new interpretation, and really highlighting the role that people played in caring for a place like Point Ellice House. The O'Reillys lived at Point Ellice House for 108 years, 3 generations. And so their story is really the primary story at Point Ellice House. It really always has been because of that long span of time. But the Wallace family did live, and it was built for the Wallace family. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And one of the things we're doing is trying to introduce the visitor to the Wallace family as well, which was not done in the past. Settler colonialism, I'll talk about that in a moment. Social life, the O'Reillys were part of the social elite of Victoria, of British Columbia, and Point Ellice House was a place for social gatherings. And then, of course, class and labor, which I've just mentioned in part. So I've mentioned the collection as a way to link to broader stories. Well, in 2020, we conducted an inventory of Point Ellice House. It took a long time because there's 12,000 objects in our collection. As some of you who've heard me speak before know, I like to tell people that we have a Trutch family Bible from 1725 and a BC Hydro Bill from 1975 and everything in between. We have 2 historic carriages, we have a golden harp and 2 pianos. You know, we have old garden tools, and we have Punch magazines from the 1860s, and just it goes on and on and on, really. And the amazing thing about it is when you step into Point Ellice House, everything you're seeing, except for the reproduction apples in the kitchen, is original to that house and was used in that room that you're standing in. That really makes Point Ellice House very special compared to some other places that may have sought objects from other places in order to fill out a room or a collection. So the collection tells us a lot about life in Victoria, particularly at the height of the British Empire. And in this way, the objects connect the house to Victoria, to British Columbia, but also to the wider, in particular, the wider British world. The O'Reillys would often travel to England and they would purchase items and have them shipped back, only the finest, as it were. And so this, the house and the collection really reflect this sort of effort to establish a settler life in a colony, or later a province and the Commonwealth, but with that still deep connection to England and to empire. You can search the collection on our website, through our website, and we've recently digitized 100 large format artworks for your perusal, so please check that out if you're interested in that kind of thing. This is a picture of the drawing room. Point Ellice House is so full that these rooms, when we took over management, were just rammed with stuff in such a way that it was almost overwhelming to experience it, because you couldn't, the only thing you could take away from the room was that, wow, there's a lot of stuff in there. And so Amy helped me and our assistant curator depopulate some of the rooms and really try to tell a better narrative through the objects that you're looking at. And then, of course, we introduced these new reading rails and stanchions that you see on the screen here. So we've been making a lot of upgrades and refreshing things. The families. I mentioned that the families are interesting. So the first family, the family that Point Ellice House was built for, was the Wallace family. If you're familiar with your early BC history, you'll know that Vancouver Island was a Hudson's Bay Company run place, and just like Victoria and Nanaimo. And John Work was one of the chief factors of Fort Victoria. And he had a 900 and something acre estate, as most of the top HBC men did in the 1850s and the early 1860s. And one of his 11 children, Kate, Métis children, Kate Work, got married in 1861 to Charles Wentworth Wallace. And so John Work carved out a small 2-acre plot on the Selkirk Water for his daughter and her new husband and their children to come. And the image you see here, the yellow highlighted part, that is the Work estate. So a significant swath of the outskirts of Victoria, and all the way up to Hillside Mall and a significant portion of the Burnside Gorge neighborhood, if you're familiar with Victoria real estate. And of course, this is a picture of Kate or Catherine Work on the left there, and then Charles Wallace on the right. Now, drum roll please, the Nanaimo connection. Charles went bankrupt in the early 1860s, about 1866, 1865, 1866. He had his finger in a number of pies. He was investing in things, and he was the agent in Victoria for the Vancouver Coal Mining and Land Company. The details of Charles's bankruptcy are scant, not because they're not out there, but only because no one has really ever bothered to look into it. Now, perhaps I'll be wrong and someone will say, I know all about that, and I hope you do. But because the O'Reilly family lived at Point Ellice House for so long, people were not, the past curators and managers of Point Ellice House were either interested in tea or they were interested in the O'Reillys. And the Wentworth Wallaces and Kate, as a Métis person, did not register on things to investigate or things to look further into. Now, thanks to digitized colonist newspapers, the details of Charles' bankruptcy were printed in the paper on the regular. He was a prominent guy, and the court proceedings were often reported on by the colonists. And so we know that his bankruptcy had something to do with his involvement with the Vancouver Coal Mining and Land Company. How exactly this happened, I don't know yet. But I do know that the Vancouver Coal Mining and Land Company are at the Nanaimo Community Archives. And I hope there's somebody from the Nanaimo Community Archives here tonight. Oh, wait, there is. So if there's any Nanaimo folks who are interested in looking at this for me, that would be great. We could talk more about that in the question period. But the point I'm making here is that there's still so much to learn. You would think a place that's been a historic site for 40, 50 years, a lot of the work would have been done. A lot of this kind of basic fundamental research work would have been done, but that's really not the case. The O'Reilly family. So the O'Reillys, Charles is bankrupt. He has to sell Point Ellice House and a number of his other possessions. And so he does, and through Matthew Bailey Begbie, Judge Begbie, who's close friends with Peter O'Reilly, they arrange for O'Reilly to buy Point Ellice House, which he does in 1867, and they move in to Point Ellice House in December 1867. And as I said, they live there until 1975. This is an image. You see Peter O'Reilly is seated in the chair with a cane there on the right-hand side. This is the lawn of Point Ellice House. This picture is about 1902. Now, Peter O'Reilly, who's Peter O'Reilly? Well, Peter comes from England, or from Ireland, rather. He's Anglo-Irish. He comes from Ireland in 1859 with a letter of recommendation to James Douglas, the governor of the colony of Vancouver Island, and the newly established colony of British Columbia. And so Peter is put to work very quickly because the Fraser River Gold Rush is on, and they need people who are well-versed in administration of British justice. And so Peter becomes a gold commissioner, a sheriff, a magistrate, and basically serves as a public servant for a number of years through basically from 1859 right up until the province of British Columbia in 1871. And he retires a little after that. But he's brought out of retirement in 1881 to become the Indian Reserve Commissioner. Sorry, just advance my slide here. So Peter O'Reilly is brought out of retirement by his brother-in-law, Joseph Trutch, who is the first Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, as I'm sure many of you here know, and comes with the Royal Engineers also in 1859 to build the Caribou Wagon Road, et cetera, et cetera. The Indian land question is a hot topic between Canada and British Columbia from 1871 right through to today, really. And that's because now I'm going to give you the Coles Notes version here, which is in 1871, BC joins Confederation and says, Canada says, where's your reserves and your treaties? And British Columbia says, oh, no, we don't have those. And Canada says, well, we'll have to establish them. And BC says, well, we don't really want to. And Canada says, well, we should. And they say, okay, but don't make them very big. And don't give them very much land, and make sure settlers get what they want. And long story short, there's a joint Indian Reserve Commission where Canada and British Columbia each pick a person, and then they pick on their own, and then they jointly pick another person, 3 guys, to go around British Columbia and establish Indian reserves. It's fraught with turmoil because they can't agree. Canada and BC can't agree because BC doesn't really want this to happen, and Canada says it has to happen, and then the commissioners don't agree. So by 1880, there's only one commissioner left, Gilbert Malcolm Sproat, and then he quits because he thinks BC is being far too harsh and not generous enough in its allocation of reserves. And so they're stuck, and they have to deal with this. So John A. MacDonald and Joseph Trutch get together, and Trutch says, I've got just the man for the job. It's Peter O'Reilly. And so Peter is brought out of retirement to get the job done, as it were. And there are about 600 Indian reserves in British Columbia. Peter O'Reilly has a hand in just about every single one of them. Historian Kenneth Braley basically says that the geography of British Columbia today owes much to the work of Peter O'Reilly, and he doesn't necessarily mean that in a good way. As many of you have heard me say before, this sign, the stop of interest sign, is at Point Ellice House. It lists every job Peter O'Reilly ever had, except for that one that he did for 18 years, where he set out almost every Indian reserve in British Columbia. That job's not listed on this plaque. And that tells you something about the narratives that have been the dominant narratives at Point Ellice House, which is, it was not talked about that Peter O'Reilly had this role to play in setting out reserves in British Columbia. It was not part of the interpretive training. You wouldn't read it on any plaques, including this one. And it was really all about ladies having tea and the Victorian romance of Kathleen O'Reilly, you know, possibly maybe getting engaged to Captain Robert Scott, these kinds of things. There's nothing wrong with those narratives, but when you purposely leave out these other ones, it makes for a bit of a skewed story. So we're talking about settler colonialism. Now, if you haven't heard the term settler colonialism before, what do we mean by when we say that? What we mean is that Canada, New Zealand, the United States, Australia, these are places where settlers never left. If you compare to a place like Kenya or India, where the settler colonizer packed up and left, it's much different. And so settler colonialism means that colonization is ongoing. It didn't end. The fact that Indian reserves today still exist on a map means that this stuff is ongoing. And so that's one of the views that we take in when we speak with people about the history of Point Ellice House and the legacy of people like Peter O'Reilly. It is from, we start at a place of understanding that this stuff is ongoing. And so why talk about it? Well, I've already mentioned Peter O'Reilly and Joseph Trutch. I should mention Peter O'Reilly married Caroline. Well, Caroline was Caroline Trutch, Joseph Trutch's sister. And so Joseph Trutch was there all the time. Sir Johnny MacDonald had dinner at Point Ellice House, where they later retreated to the study and talked about the Indian land question. I mean, these people, Begbie, Trutch, MacDonald, you've heard them in the news, you've seen their statues come down. Well, they're all intimately connected with Point Ellice House. Of course, the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission asks us to talk about these things, and then most recently, the report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. We say in the exhibit text of the politics of, for the politics of luxury, we take this approach, talking about settler colonialism, not to dwell on the injustices of the past, but as an opportunity to think about how we might address colonialism's injustices now and in the future. This is probably, at the moment, the most prominent example of that. And this is in Peter's study in the house, where he would, after he would travel to set out reserves, he would come back and he would do his work. And we have a quote here from Peter, which talks about how the land is being wasted, essentially. And as we say in this new interpretive panel, the view that Indigenous peoples were not making proper use of the land was prominent in Canada. Today, the TRC calls on us to reject the concepts that were used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples. And really, that was Peter O'Reilly's job since 1859, but especially from 1881 to 1898. Shifting gears a little bit, what else is interesting about Point Ellice House? The gardens and the landscape. Point Ellice House is on 2 acres, and we have many mature trees, from a giant sequoia to a number of significant arbutus trees, Gary oak trees, fir trees, mountain ash, Oregon ash. It's just such a special place for birds. Every day we see eagles or herons and kingfishers and songbirds. The swallows are at Point Ellice House right now. Flickers and ravens and crows, lots of crows. Wildlife like otters and river otters and mink and raccoons and deer. And the gardens are actually one of the best still intact examples of Victorian gardens. Essentially, the gardens are unchanged as Peter O'Reilly and in particular his daughter Kathleen set them out starting in about the 1870s through to the early 1900s. So lots of mature plants, lilacs that have been there for about 120 years. This is a picture of Point Ellice House from 1863 or thereabouts. Point Ellice House is on the left here. The Tyrwhitt Drake House is on the right, now demolished. But note the enormous fir trees in the background here. What's important to remember is that these houses, when they were built, weren't even in Victoria. They didn't actually become part of the city of Victoria until the 1890s. This is a semi-rural estate, essentially. This right here, if you can see my cursor in the bottom left here, this little tree, we're pretty sure that's an arbutus tree, and we're pretty sure that tree is still standing today. It's enormous. If you come visit, I'll show it to you. Things changed though. This is an aerial image of Selkirk Water from 1954. If you're having trouble getting oriented, this is the Point Ellice Bridge. And this is the CNR rail yards here. And this is Point Ellice House, the only place with any trees, really. By the 1930s, a lot of the old families owe back taxes, and so they have to sell them to the city, and industry gets even closer to Point Ellice House. But note here, it's still a bit of a working class neighborhood. There's a lot of residences here. If you visit today, you will note that every single one of these has been demolished except for Point Ellice House and this one tiny little house here almost at the corner of Hillside and Bridge Street. So the neighborhood has changed a lot even since the 1950s. Of course, Victoria Harbour has always been quite industrial, and you can see the log booms here on the waterway. I'm going to show you a video of what Point Ellice House looks like today. This is some drone footage for you. There is the house itself, and you can see the giant sequoia there, the arbutus trees, beautiful Selkirk Water, and then, oh, there's our neighbor. That is Schnitzer Steel Recycling. I don't know if you've ever tried to operate a business or which requires people to visit you in the middle of an industrial neighborhood, but it's not easy. Those are waste transfer stations. Then we have the Victoria Landscape Gravel Mart, which is loading gravel into people's cars every day for 10 hours a day. Most people have never visited us because this isn't a place that you just casually stroll down the street. It's not so pleasant these days, unless, of course, you come inside the gates of Point Ellice House. This is a waste transfer station, waste transfer station, waste transfer station. If you put something in the garbage at in Victoria, it probably ends up somewhere in and around Point Ellice House. Concluding here shortly. I just wanted to give you a sense of the context in which we're doing this work, which is a very dramatically changed neighborhood. I've mentioned the historic gardens. I'm talking about the historic gardens. Beginning last year, we began a rehabilitation of our South Garden. The South Garden was the kitchen garden for Point Ellice House, so where they grew food and cut flowers. And essentially beginning in the post-war, post-Second World War period, the site was turfed over and forgotten about. And even when we took over in 2019, really it was just a lawn and then a rhubarb plant and a rosemary plant. And that was about it. It was completely overgrown, as you can see in the image on the right-hand side. And so we began a rehabilitation of it. And the first thing that we uncovered by accident was this amazing brick pathway that was about 8 inches underneath the soil. We did learn that there were past archaeological reports that kind of identified the existence of a pathway, but it had never been uncovered before. So it went from a little rehabilitation to now also restoring a brick pathway. And you can see in the drone footage here, the extent of what we were able to uncover. But what we're also doing is growing food for the community. So now the historic use of the site, which was growing food and flowers, we're doing that again. And so the food is actually going to Sandy Merriman House, which is an emergency transition house for women in Victoria. And so we're doing this great thing where we're linking up with the community, growing food for the community, but we're also reinstating the historic use of this space. So we're very proud of this. And I'll just try and skip ahead here. Wrapping up, we're reopening. If you find yourself in Victoria when travel opens up again and you feel safe, please come visit us this summer or this fall. Admission is by appointment and by donation. The interior of the historic house is not open at the moment because of just extreme caution. There's no HVAC system in an 1860s house, and we can't just throw open all the windows, so we want to be extra safe. As a little thank you for inviting me and for listening to me, and if you want to support us, check out our online store and type in this code, SPRING for 10, get 10% off your purchase. That says until May 1st, but that's from a presentation I gave about a month ago. So it still works, and if it doesn't work, just email me, but type that in. If we have some beautiful cards and stationery, it's a great way to support our work and share some of the collection with your friends. Writing letters is a good thing to do these days, I think. As I said, we're opening next weekend, if you can believe it. I know I barely can. And if you want to contact me, please do so. There's some information up there. If you're a history nerd, and I know you all are because you're here, go to our blog. We have a lot of blog entries that we've been working on over the last 2 years that talk a lot more about certain items from the collection and stories of the site and what we've been up to. So it's a really great place to dig around and learn a little bit more about Point Ellice House. And with that, I will open it up to questions. I hope I didn't go too long. And I hope I didn't go too fast either. And here's my cat, just in time.
Well,
Kelly.
I'm curious about the development and subdivision history prior to 1950, say in the 20th century. Like, I'm assuming that there were neighboring and comparable lots and properties beside it during the early part of the 20th century. And so I'm wondering how it went to industrial. I know they were selling their properties for taxes, but how did Point Ellice House manage to survive all by itself, surrounded by all the industrial zone property?
Well, so the quick answer to the first part is that in and around Point Ellice House and across the water from Point Ellice House there'd always been industry around, like shipyards across the water from the 1860s, for example. But the big mill, the Lee and Sons mill, moves in about 1910, and that has a really profound impact. But the larger houses, that just people died and they sold off, or back taxes and were sold off. The only reason Point Ellice House exists is because the O'Reillys just didn't sell when they came knocking, and they absolutely came knocking. They didn't sell. Now, they were tempted, and we did almost lose Point Ellice House a couple of times in the 1950s, but it didn't happen. It almost happened again in the 1960s, but John O'Reilly, who is the grandson of Peter O'Reilly, the son of Arthur, Jack, and his wife Mary, he is living at his mom. Mary dies in 1863, and then he meets this woman Inez, and they get married. And Inez is one day, so the story goes, looking through some drawers, and there's like a letter from Prime Minister MacDonald in the drawer, and she's like, "What? Look, we got to do something with this place." And she convinces him to open it as a private museum and bring attention to it. and she was a history buff, as the O'Reilly family was as well. And that's really why they lobbied to have the government buy it. And at the time, the NDP government of the time was interested, and the government then was more interested in heritage now than I think they are now. And they did buy it. And that's really just a series of events that is the only reason Point Ellice House is still with us.
Where did the displaced O'Reillys go?
Well,
this was 1975?
1975, John and Inez moved to Beach Drive, and they lived there for the rest of their lives. They never had children, but Inez had children from another marriage, and her son, Tom Whiffen, lives in Vancouver, and he actually came and visited us a couple of years ago, which was really nice.
And just to remind me, O'Reilly's had it since 67?
Correct.
I mean, Inez's.
Sorry?
As I meant, Inez has had it since 1967.
John and Inez opened it as a private museum in 1967.
67.
Kelly, you have successfully made me feel very, and I might add quite unsubtly too, guilty into looking up those records for you. When I go back to work, I'll have a look and see. I don't know off the top of my head, but I think most of ours start around 1873, but I will check for you. And the other thing is not a question, well, neither was that, but it's more of a comment. I find it fascinating and a really good positive thing that you as a museum take your kitchen garden and donate that to a community kitchen. I think that interaction with the community is very, very smart and just a great thing to do. So I really commend you for doing that.
Thanks, Christine, and no pressure on the records thing. You know, I do get up to Nanaimo when public health allows, and
Yeah.
I'm always happy to, pop into the Nanaimo archives. So
Sure.
always happy to do my own digging too. But I did look it up on Memory BC, and it says the records start in the early 1860s. Now, Memory BC might be different than what's there, but could be something there. It's always fun to check it out.
Well,
and yeah,
we'll have a look.
thanks. We're very proud of the community aspect of that. It really gets the community invested in the place. Even if you're not interested in history, there's lots of people who are just interested in growing food. And it's a little bit of a subversive way to get them interested in history too.
Well, I say kudos to that.
So Kelly, can I ask you, a Vancouver Island Local History Society, they look after Point Ellice, do they look after anything else? And how did they get that name?
How do you get that name? Oh, the name comes because nobody else had the name. And we needed a name for a not-for-profit society. When the society was formed, there's ambitions to do more, but right now it's really just a society to operate the site.
So Kelly, it's always a challenge when you take a well-known and popular historic site and kind of reset the story. I commend you on it because it is a risk because there's been a lot of popular sentiment around the building. So what has the reaction been?
Good question, and you're right. At first, there were people who were definitely like, "What do you mean you don't serve tea? How dare you? How dare you not serve tea?" But when we started inviting people back after we made a bunch of changes and we reopened to the public, the feedback, and Amy knows this, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive, especially because we opened it up to a whole new world of people who had never ever want to step foot in a place like Point Ellice House before, mainly because they either had no interest in tea or they had no interest in going on a 1-hour guided tour. Point Ellice House is self-guided now. You can spend 10 minutes or you can spend 3 hours if you want. But you can imagine most people with a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old don't want to come on a 1-hour guided tour and then have tea. And so while there were certainly people who were upset, overwhelmingly, I can say with a lot of confidence that there are people who otherwise would never have encountered the story of Point Ellice House. And to me, that's far more important than than protecting, you know, people's love of tea. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
A bit of sarcasm there.
I have a question. Kelly, what is, two questions actually. What's on your wish list for next things to happen there? And the other thing is, what was your interest in naming that you mentioned?
Oh, my wish list. Well, so you guys, you wanted me to keep you here till midnight, huh? I got a big wish list. Well, you, before I speak to that, Susan, you've been in one of my classes. You know, I have an interest in naming, in how places are named and renamed, right? So communities, where communities in BC get, or other places get their names from. And so that's my interest is there. And then my wish list, my biggest thing that I would like to see for Point Ellice House is a new collections building. Point Ellice House is essentially open air storage. A lot of things are not in the proper climate controlled conservation grade facilities. And this creates all kinds of difficulties when you have 12,000 objects. And so I would love to see a new collections building built essentially where the parking lot is, but that's a project that will cost, you know, a couple million, few $1 million. And right now it's hard to get like $100,000 from the province of British Columbia. So it's on the back burner, but we've definitely been working on it. Right now we're building a new fence in the south garden along our property boundary, which will be done next week. And we've also just started some plaster repairs. So there's always stuff going on. My other wish is just to be properly funded, to just get sustainable funding from the province. This is a site that the province of BC owns, which means it's also owned by the people of British Columbia, which means it deserves to be funded in a sustainable, ongoing way. And right now it is not. So write your MLA. Tell Sheila what you think.
Does your society have charitable status?
Yes, we do.
Kelly, you do. Okay.
Yes. Thanks for the question, Susan.
If
Oh, yeah.
I may, I apologize. I was at another meeting, so I missed the beginning part, Kelly. But
Yeah.
I'm just curious about your garden. Does it grow like heritage plants?
Absolutely, yes. We have in the 1980s there was a extensive garden plant report done, and we have a list of historic plants. So a number of the a lot of the plant material we have is historic plant material, but then we make sure, other than the food gardens, which we tend to just kind of grow what will grow well, but we make sure we plant things that are connected to that. So recently we just bought a brand new rhododendron, but it's exactly the same variety that the O'Reillys grew, and we're going to plant it where it grew. So they're living gardens though, so they're always changing, and climate change makes things difficult, and the changing neighborhood. For example, we had to cut down a number of elm trees, which were not heritage trees, but if we wanted to grow food, we needed light for the food, and all of these elm trees had been allowed to grow up over the last 50 or 80 years, and so we had to take a few of them out. So the gardens are a lot like a collection, but they're a living, changing collection, and that's how we kind of understand them.
Well, that's really interesting. I definitely want to come visit, but I want to get in the house, so I'm going to wait till your house is open. Unless you're willing to give us a tour and sneak us in.
Well, I will give you a tour when it's open, absolutely. If you're interested though in what the inside of the house looks like right now from the comfort of your home, if you go on our YouTube channel, we have a room by room video playlist. And so far we've done all the kind of significant rooms, like the drawing room and the study. And they're about 2-minute videos where we just show you up close what the inside looks like. So that's a good sneak peek for seeing the real thing. Daryl?
Yeah, considering that it's over 150-year-old wood frame building, do you have any structural or foundation challenges to deal with? Or
good question. We had an assessment done of the house in 2019, which showed that Point Ellice House is surprisingly structurally very sound. Now, that doesn't mean there are not issues, for example, with plaster cracks, and we're doing plaster repairs right now, and there are some large cracks, but that doesn't mean that the house will fall. That it might mean that a piece of plaster could fall down, but the house itself is actually in remarkably good shape.
And it's on its original foundation?
It absolutely is, yep.
Hmm.
How do you handle
Nora.
security? How do you handle security?
Well, we have a big fence, a big, tall, white picket fence, and we have a tenant that lives in a carriage house on site. And he's not a caretaker, but he's definitely a person that's there, a physical presence. And then, of course, we have some security cameras around the site as well. And alarms, of course, as well. But it is definitely an ongoing issue that we have to be very vigilant about.
So you have
Anybody
a
else?
long-term plan for the site of both physical and in telling its story.
Sorry, what was that?
You have a long-term plan in terms of redeveloping the house and further developing stories associated with the families and the history of the place.
Absolutely. Right now, for example, I'm working on a permanent exhibit about the Indian Reserve Commission that I'm hoping the province will fund. And we have a strategic plan for the remainder of our agreement, which is a 5-year agreement to operate Point Ellice House. So it's hard to plan beyond 5 years. But of course, everything we do is always to conserve the house and the collection. So that's definitely part of our long-term thinking as well when we do things like plaster repairs and what have you. But there's definitely, as Susan was saying, a wish list of interpretive programs that we would like to develop and undertake, but it really comes down to financial support. So plenty of ideas and excellent people behind carrying out those ideas, but getting the support to do it is another thing entirely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
We definitely.
So any other questions?
I see in the chat from Marina that yes, it's definitely an opportunity to grow heirloom veggies. This is only our second summer growing any food, so we're just getting started. But we definitely would like to identify some heirloom veggies that we know the O'Reillys grew, so we could do exactly that.
Great.
I have to say, Kelly, when I was there, I'm going to say it was like maybe about 2001, something like that. I was there on a weekend. I was the only person there. And in those days, they would give you headphones. Remember, and you'd walk through. And even then, the voice, whoever did the voice for the Irish maid, was a little bit Monty Pythonish. Honestly, even then I thought, well, this is just too silly almost. And they were wonderful. I did, in fact, I confess, I did have tea and I did like it. And I was the only one there, and they let me sit on the lawn all afternoon. Because once I went through the house, you're right, it was a little bit like going to a hoarder's house, or what I imagine a hoarder's house was like. I noticed the picture of the drawing room, and you can actually get a sense of what it may have been like to live there now, which I didn't get when I was there, because it was you almost felt claustrophobic in it before. So I was really glad to see those changes. And the other thing that I've noticed, especially in terms of the gardens there, is that Vancouver Island, considering its climate, has remarkably few public gardens. So I think there's an opportunity there to really do something for people that maybe aren't that interested in the architecture or the other things, but do really enjoy gardens. It always surprises me that we have so few. And also, people are really, you picked a good time to develop a vegetable garden.
Yeah.
If any time during the pandemic was the time to do it.
And it's part of the reason, it's a good point about the gardens, Christine, and that's part of the reason that I've been trying to talk more about the natural history of Point Ellice House, the arbutus trees, the Gary oaks. I mean, when you get there, it's very special, not only because everything else around us is industry, but even just in Victoria generally, it's quite special being on the Gorge Waterway. It's the longest remaining natural shoreline on the Gorge Waterway and Selkirk Waters. So that part of it is hugely significant. The fact that you can come and talk to volunteers on the lawn and there's a great blue heron nesting behind you. And that's really, really special. So we've been partnering with the Naturehood and the Victoria Migratory Bird Sanctuary people to talk more about that. And that's a whole other side of things. And next week, late next week, the Bateman Foundation will be putting out a podcast about arbutus trees, and we'll be featured, Point Ellice House will be featured in that, just talking about arbutus trees and the cultural history of them at Point Ellice House. So that's that whole other realm that I wish I could hire somebody just to talk about that stuff.
It's very timely. Do you feel in your immediate environs around you that there's any kind of move towards gentrification, or are there any development permits? Do you feel that some of those industries will move further out and that will be replaced, as it often is in industrial areas, with condos and things like that? Are you feeling any of that?
That's something that people like to say. They like to say, oh, well, don't worry, in 10 years, this will be condos. But the thing is that no, it won't be. And the reason I say that is because the official community plan for Victoria and for that part of Victoria says, this is light industry. This will continue to be light industry. Now, that's not to say that the nature of that might change. I mean, we could have a cabinet making shop next door to us one day rather than a a car crushing facility. But in terms of, official community plans and stuff, it's going to stay more or less how it is. Now, that's not to say the neighborhood isn't changing. I mean, we have like 4 breweries within a stone's throw of us, for example, which wasn't the case 10 or 15 years ago. So the surrounding neighborhood closer to Bridge Street is changing a little bit in terms of the types of businesses. But in terms of our immediate neighbors, it doesn't look like it'll change anytime soon. And I want to say, unfortunately, I mean, there's something to the history of industry in the area, and that's something we try to talk about at Point Ellice House, is that this is our neighborhood, like it or lump it, and there's a rich history of different mills and different, tanneries and stuff like that can definitely be talked about. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Ask me again in 20 years.
So Daryl, would you like to go ahead and thank Kelly if nobody has any questions, any more questions?
Well, there's just one more question I'd like to have answered. I'm wondering, Kelly, during the 50s and 60s, were the O'Reillys considered eccentrics or characters for hanging on in this house in the neighborhood after it had changed? And of course, living amidst the 100-year-old furnishings and contents?
Yes. Everyone. So the great thing about a lot of people alive still, there are a lot of people alive that knew John and Inez in particular, and that have stories about meeting them. Pretty much everybody says, oh yeah, John, he was a weird guy, eh? And he was definitely a character. And we actually ordered his Second World War at medical records, and they say, like he's got some mental things going on. But all that to say that he was a character. Inez was a character. I mean, for sure. She was a very interesting woman. And there's actually a CBC documentary from 1962. It's in the VIU Special Collections VHS tape. And it's called Victoria 100. And this CBC documentary crew goes to Victoria, and they go all around and they interview, and they go up island and stuff. And they come to Point Ellice House in 1962, and they interview Mary Wyndham O'Reilly. And they basically, I mean, these guys are from Toronto. They think Victoria is some backwoods, British hoity-toity, and they weren't wrong really, but they're kind of making fun of things. But they ask her, what's it like living here? Look at all this stuff. It's kind of odd. And she says, in this kind of British Victoria accent. Oh yes, we just if something's in the way, we just shove it into the other room, and then if we need to get in there, well, then we just shove it over there. Yeah, they were characters, and people knew they were characters for sure in the 50s and 60s. And as I said, people are still talking about that today.
Well, thank you. And with that, I'd like to extend our appreciation on behalf of the Nanaimo Historical Society to you for dedicating your evening to us and for researching and maintaining the whole and unvarnished provenance of Point Ellice House. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Lovely to see everyone.